Hello and welcome to Automated, our weekly podcast where we talk about how to build robots and how much fun they sometimes aren't. I, of course, am Stefan Selsoxmacher, one of your hosts here and CEO and co-founder at Polymath Robotics. Across the table from me is someone who's wearing a Polymath Robotics t-shirt, but I don't seem to know what his name is. Who exactly are you?
Oh, I'm repping the team so hard this week. I'm so proud of our team. We just came out of a month of solid effort and a conference, and everything went off without a hitch, more or less. Incredible.
I caught up with some people who I used to work with this weekend for a Patty's Day party, and I described our last month. They're like, yeah, I don't miss working for your startup. So this, of course, is Automated, our weekly podcast, which is split into two sections. The first of which is we'll play a game where I will draw a technology card, Ilya will draw a setting card, and we'll spitball creating a robot. And the second part, we'll talk through a topic. And Ilya, what are we going to talk about today?
Well, we're going to talk about our experience at CONEXPO, where we just were last week. So sorry for missing a weekly podcast. And what that kind of try to draw some general conclusions.
Yep. And CONEXPO is, of course, one of the largest construction equipment conferences in the world. We saw a lot of big, heavy machines that, frankly, at Polymath, we'd love to get our code all over. So with that being said, Ilya, to get into our game, Ilya, what's going to be our setting for the week?
So I'm going to draw a setting card here, and we have construction.
Oh, so random that might happen after coming from a construction equipment conference.
We continue our proud tradition of unbiased choice.
Yeah, it would not be a good game show if we did not do that. For this week, for tech, I just drew the technology card walking robots. How could we use walking robots in construction? So, I mean, a thing that seems very obvious to me to start off with is surveying the site to make sure that it is what you think it is, or that you're capturing the progress of how the site's supposed to be going. And walking might actually be useful because, like, maybe sometimes it's jumping from steel girder to steel girder. Maybe sometimes it's walking up the stairs on a second floor colonial McMansion.
Well, I think, if you look at Boston Dynamics Spot robot, a lot of construction companies are trying to use that thing for surveying as built versus as designed, doing a lot of those kind of comparisons, doing safety spot checks, that sort of stuff.
Yeah, there we go.
So I think walking actually makes a lot of sense for a construction site because you're not guaranteed a nice smooth floor for tires. Yep. And there might be small steps or stairs.
And it's somehow better than flying because you get to walk.
Well,
like a quadcopter that would never work in this environment. I think, let's solve walking and jumping from steel girders.
I think it's more about runtime. Yeah. A walking robot can operate for several hours, and a quadrotor can operate for 15 minutes.
You can also have a battery on site. But we drew the walking card, so we're walking. So it's a walking robot that would go and maybe do a LiDAR scan and show you how it is different from the plan.
Yeah. Yeah.
So all you need now is the construction engineer to build a perfect plan, because if everything is off by 3%, you'll have no meaningful data.
Well, here's the really fun part.
And the great thing about data analysis is garbage in, pristine out is the saying that I always hear.
Oh, yeah. No. Here's the even better part. You get the construction company to actually use some sort of source control for their plans.
Naturally.
Like Git or whatever.
Step one.
No, but there's a reason for this.
Of course.
So the engineers,
it would be good if they did.
If the engineers and architects put their stuff as commits, which everybody in the kind of software world is more or less familiar with.
I'm sure they take to that rapidly.
So what the robot does is, as it's going around and it notices a mistake, it will look up in the commit history and literally be like, Jeff got this wrong. This specific pipe, Jeff's fault.
or Bob the pipe fitter put this in the wrong spot.
Exactly.
Jeff or Bob are wrong and write them up. The pipe fitters union will love that. And in general, just like if any robot that initially starts off with a requirement of change the entire workflow of a $3 trillion industry, I'm a fan.
Yeah.
I'm a fan of that step one of robot.
Well, like at this conference, we saw these robots who are painting plans on the ground. So this is kind of another step where instead of wheels, it actually walks around and does it. And to fuse in another idea we were discussing, some of the time it glitches and writes down coupon codes for McDonald's onto the ground as well, so that the construction workers get hungry and go to their favorite restaurant nearby.
So we have this walking robot, this like Atlas or something.
No. Quadruped.
Quadruped.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
For sure, like a Spot.
That was a bipedal robot.
No.
All right, so Spot walking around, scanning to make sure you're doing it perfectly. So a Spot runs you what, $250,000, a full sized one, I think.
I think they're cheaper now.
150.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, what's $100,000 between friends?
Exactly.
So that for 100K, we need to first build a software package that it takes the construction world by storm, and they all now use a GitHub-like interface to perfectly 3D model out the buildings they're going to build.
Yeah.
And I have one question. If you have all that data source of truth, why not just use like augmented reality glasses and have a human look at things and measure how they're off?
I would love that. It's funny. On that note, like I tried out the HoloLens thing at CES. They had a stand, and they were doing this thing, and they were like, here's the HoloLens, and like, here's an example. You could look at this engine, and it would show you stuff. Very, very cool. And then I asked a very simple question of like, how accurate is it? They said, it's millimeter accurate across the space. Okay, but if I walk 10 feet that way, how accurate is it? They're like, it doesn't support that use case. It gets really inaccurate really quickly. Like, okay, well, so maybe that's why this hasn't been adopted.
So you just have a human wearing AR glasses walk meter by meter and look at how accurate everything is.
So we close the loop. As the robot's walking around, it paints in April tag codes on the ground. Mm-hmm. And your glasses measure those April tag codes, and that's how it knows where you're positioned in 3D space.
So really, ultimately, all our Spot robot is doing is putting April tags down for humans to look at it later.
And blaming other people.
Yes, naturally. So I think for this package, we're probably replacing a surveyor who's making 140 a year with our, call it $250,000 robot package and our massive SaaS tool to perfectly 3D model out all buildings.
Yep.
I'd say we get away with this service for a comfortable $75,000 to $150,000 per year, and you still need a person to use it.
Yeah, I mean, definitely the Spot robot is not going to wander around by itself.
Yep.
I wish they were that intelligent. They're not.
I mean, if you already have a perfect map, which means you first need the person with the AR glasses to mark out with the LiDAR anyway.
But even if you have a perfect map, somebody left out a pile of tools somewhere. Yep. There's some lumber that's not where it's supposed to be. Like,
you can parkour over that. Going to a construction site near you, Survey Dog 3000 will revolutionize your construction site after you've already revolutionized your entire construction workflow. And with that, let's actually talk about this conference we went to. So to paint the picture, CONEXPO is somehow larger than CES, or at least seems like it. There's equipment everywhere. There's all sorts of weird machines. It also, personally, was a very weird vibe as far as conferences go. CES, it's a bunch of like 20-year-olds who are then getting fun at night. The Tulare Ag Show is a bunch of like farmers walking around with their families. Most conferences, pretty, button up, whatever. This is the only conference I've been at where I've seen a lot of people double fisting at 9 a.m. and then coming up
beer to be quickly
doing demos of our bulldozer, like stumbling towards us drunk, like, what does this do? Oh, that's scary, and wander away, which was, a take. But I guess, like, what was your main takeaway from the conference?
Yeah, I mean, everybody always reads these headlines of people are kind of concerned about robots replacing them and that kind of stuff. But I think we actually got, to my mind, a very surprisingly positive reception from people about wanting to use something like this, wanting to enable autonomy.
And why do they want it?
It seems like, people were very impressed with the tech and the demo, and people like that. And that was nice to hear. But mostly the concern I got is yes, like, we need something like this. We can't hire people.
Yeah.
And I've heard something of this, but I was pretty surprised with how in-depth this refrain came about over and over and over, that like, we cannot hire people.
And I gotta say, it annoys me that that's a surprise, because like, frankly, the only people who seem particularly worried about robots taking all our jobs are like white collar city living people who don't work on construction sites or mines or farms, who like just think like, those poor people really love driving bulldozers. But in reality, like, if you talk to anyone who works in these heavy industries, it's always like, we can't hire people. These jobs suck. People die all the time. The workforce of our local area has hollowed out over the last 25 years, and we just need to keep on getting material out of the ground.
Yeah, and even just simple stuff. Like, one manufacturer came up to us and they couldn't hire for a position where they just drive their test vehicle up and down rumble strips for 8 hours a day. Because your teeth fillings fly out after getting rumbled.
It turns out people don't like their spleen being shaken apart. Yeah. It's where they're very picky that way. No one wants to work these days, is what I have to say about it.
And the larger political context with some states repealing child labor laws and things like that, there is definitely a labor shortage that people see and can't solve in any way that doesn't involve greater efficiency, which is ultimately what autonomy brings.
One of my favorite things about the show is like there's so much equipment. There's so many things that people are building for this application or that. We met companies who build machines that just put in posts so you can fence in your cattle ranch. Large companies that crush rocks so that you can make aggregate and do it on a mobile basis. There are so many types of equipment.
Super specialized, like incredibly specialized.
And like the reality is, like for many of these applications, there's never going to be a time when like someone in Silicon Valley it's going to make sense for them to build a vertically integrated robotics business to automate those.
Yeah, like we heard the barge example. Mm-hmm. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, so we met a company who puts, I think, aggregates being like busted up rocks that you might use for gravel. They put them into barges that come from some coal facility. So before they put their precious, sweet rocks into these barges, they have to clean out all the coal residue. And there's kind of two parts of that. First of all, they hose the inside of the barge down. They then drop a couple of skid steers like bobcats into the barge to shovel the coal residue towards this like big rotating
like a wire brush.
Yeah, like a massive wire brush that is like a meter or two wide by like, I don't know, maybe 4 meters in diameter. Oh, and while you're doing this, you get to breathe coal fumes. So if you want to feel like a cool hipster and have the black lung, I got a job for you. And to top it all off, not infrequently, someone shovels coal residue a little too close to the wire brush and they get wire brushed. You don't come back after something like that. And this is a job that like they probably hire 10 to 20 people to do, to just shovel this coal residue around between 5 or so ports around the country.
And from the technology autonomy perspective, I can't imagine a simpler task. Like it is a perfect box.
It's a Roomba.
It is a box that you need to cover every corner and bring it to one spot. It is a Roomba. That's exactly right. It is like there's nothing to avoid. It is a straight space.
Yep. And you're probably realistically, for that use case alone, if they have 10 of these vehicles, you're probably talking about $500,000 per year of labor cost. Yeah. And frankly, killing people likelihood that you can eliminate with like pretty straightforward robotics.
Very like first year university straightforward robotics. Yeah. It's kind of astonishing. And there's so many use cases like that.
Yeah.
Something that Stefan and I have been talking about is it kind of starts to make autonomy seem like the underlying enabling operating system.
But not the value. Like the value is hey, about shoveling out coal barges and that they need to be shoveled out this way and that here's how you interact with that big wire brush and you do this, and that.
Or just knowing that you have to wire brush out coal dust in the first place.
Yeah. Like, and having an in on a company who cares about this operation.
Yeah, like I never would have thought that's a task that people do.
Yeah.
Right? So that's the thing that we kind of started talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I'm liking this a lot. This type of thing makes me think about autonomy not so much as the actual product, but more as like almost like the operating system. So like, I mean, I think of a good old, Windows 95, Windows ME, Windows XP, all the classics. And there's a lot of features you get for free from them. Like I've never really thought about how you do file management
or process management, or security.
I just like to dig into that. Like what is process and file management? Let's say I'm opening Word to write a strongly written letter to a local fast food institution for discontinuing the ribwich. What else is going on my computer?
Or Szechuan sauce for Rick and Morty fans out there. Yeah. So if I or someone was to write a very simple word processor, right? You don't have to worry about exactly how you're storing the file where on a disk. Yeah. You don't have to worry about how to.
I thought the computer just sorted all that out.
Just magic.
Like exactly. IBM knows how to do that.
Yeah, that's your OS, right? You don't have to worry about how, like, who has permission to a file, how to make sure that your process gains enough CPU time and RAM to do what it needs to do. You don't have to worry about how you actually, the OS hands you a pointer to that file and stores it correctly. And there's all these tasks where at the end of the day, if you wanted to write a half decent word processor in Python, it would take, 20 lines of code because almost the entire rest of it is taken up by the system.
Yeah. And whereas I think when it comes to automating robots or automating vehicles, controls kind of falls into that. A safety system that recognizes if the system isn't working right and makes it stop if it's not working right looks a lot like that. There's a bunch of these capabilities that like you don't get any credit for by building. Like nobody frankly cares.
Yeah. When was the last time you heard somebody say, I use Windows because it has the best multi-processor process manager out there?
Man, it's so good at finding my files. Like I got a big technical achievement for you, Leah. I built an operating system, and when you click on a file, it opens.
Yeah.
It took us months. This took us like 2 years to get, but like I'm very excited to demo it to you today.
It's funny because you kind of hear the opposite, right? Like a lot of roboticists will use Linux because you don't have the Windows OS come in and suddenly delay all your processes by like 300 milliseconds because it just decided to do some sort of cleaning process. You have no idea what it's doing, right? So like file management is not the thing that attracts you to a Mac or a Windows or whatever, or Linux. It's like the 30th concern, if that.
Yeah. So I mean, I think that was interesting. What other things did you see? I mean, something that I also saw at CONEXPO was it feels like a lot of people have tried to automate a lot of things.
Yeah, there's a particularly interesting, very specialized machine to tie rebar together for concrete pours and for bridges. I think was one of the first things they were doing.
Yep.
And again, you wouldn't think like tying rebar together is such a big deal, but it takes a huge amount of time.
Yep.
It takes so much time that it makes economic sense to buy and spend the time to set up a machine. There's a big like overpass machine just to tie rebar ties together.
That's crazy.
Yeah. Right. Like that's crazy if you think about it. Right.
Yeah.
Like how much time it must take for that to make economic sense. Which I'm sure it does. Like there's a whole business around it. They have machines that they're showing off. And there's just so many of these specialized little cases, which to Stefan's analogy is kind of this almost special purpose programs that don't really have a common OS to run on.
Yeah. And frankly, they often end up building some super weird machine that only kind of works in their use case. And it's a super expensive machine. They have to fly people out every time there's a problem, which makes sense. Like how many people need to cure asphalt on the roadway and move at a quarter of a mile per hour to do so. That's not a very common problem, but all those people do need to hire someone to sit on top of it. And all those people do need to take some form of instructions that look incredibly non-readable and turn them into something that a human can follow, or let alone a robot can follow.
Yeah. And I think in particular in the construction space, there is, of course, from a roboticist standpoint, there is the land of chaos, which is the construction of like a single family dwelling home.
Yeah.
Right.
Unless you're building a whole
subdivision. Yeah, exactly. Where it's repetitive. But like something like a hotel or an apartment complex is much more ordered and much more planned. But just my point being that like generally the construction runs a spectrum from like guy with a shovel in his backyard all the way to multi-year, very carefully planned, dam or bridge or
building a mine.
Exactly. So robotics isn't going to play well in the space of guy with a shovel in his backyard for a long time.
Well, I mean, it can if you have a really good app that guy with a shovel can interact with.
Even just economic sense and all that kind of stuff, right?
Well, I mean, there's use cases like graders that literally just drive around a site and make them flat.
But that's my example of a perfect robotics case, right?
Yeah.
Like that's the opposite of chaos in a lot of ways, right? Like you have very specific instructions of like this area needs to be flat to this understanding of flat.
Well, a guy with a shovel like building a treehouse for his kid is the opposite of that.
Very long away.
But I think like there's a world where the next 5 to 10 years or so, if you have a good app, you can sell your machine or you can lease your machine better than others can if it's then just does a whole discrete job. Like basically if it's like, hey, you got this app, now take this special GPS, walk around the perimeter of where you want to be flat, click this button on your phone, it's going to tell you where it thinks you want to do, and then let it grade for the next 8 hours.
And let it go.
Yep.
And I think part of the reason we've seen in modern days smartphones take off as much as they have is because of kind of this idea of app store. And we would love to see that in the robotics space.
I think that's fundamentally what makes robots real.
Exactly. But there's no underlying common understanding between that. And again, we're big fans of Ross here. Yep. Ross has kind of taken steps in that direction, but I think Ross is still at the layer of Linux, file Unix. Manager. Yeah. Here's how I've improved the efficiency of the file manager by 5% in these corner cases.
I think the beauty of the App Store example is that like the App Store has so incredibly lowered the bar of how smart and technical you need to be to make a valuable product that like we've forgotten about it. Like a lot of people just pretend that someone who's like the CTO of a business app is similarly smart as an engineer as like Woz. But in reality, they can just kind of tie a couple of things together and make a bunch of money because they don't have to make a cloud backend. They don't have to make a social login. They don't have to host documents. They can just kind of tie a bunch of stuff together and make value.
Yeah. I mean, I forgot there's a funny anecdote I've heard where recently employers are starting to have problems with younger employees because they don't deal with files the same way. When we talk about like file access and putting in a folder somewhere, like this pisses me off about smartphones is like, I want to access my files how I'm used to accessing them, which is files in a folder somewhere. Whereas Android and Apple is just like, don't worry about it. Don't worry about where they are. Like search. They're just there. They're just somewhere.
You'll get it when you need it.
Exactly. And so when you're writing that app, it's the same thing. It's like, don't worry about it. Just write your app and don't worry about how the underlying system works. And we need to get robotics to that state. Yeah. I think.
Yeah.
It's too
right now you need to be too smart to do anything in robots.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not going to get there.
With that being said, Ilya, what are we talking about next week?
We're going to talk about how Stefan always asks me what we're talking about and what that means.
Decide until 3 minutes before what
that means for the future of polymath robotics.
If I'm found in a ditch somewhere, you know who to suspect. Well, with that being said, thanks so much for joining us this week. We'll be here to talk about robots with you more soon.
See you next time.